Welcome. Good morning. My name is Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Very glad to see such a distinguished group here. We've got a lot of people in the audience who will have much to contribute as the morning goes along. As many of you who are involved in this discourse or in the business of journalism in one way or another know, the subject of the future of journalism is now itself almost an industry that's generating as much employment as newspaper newsrooms, and though it's generally uncompensated, it's still attracting a lot of time and attention for many of us, and I think for good reason. I think as a participant, sometimes ad hoc in this discourse myself, I've noticed since the conversation really started to intensify last fall through the moment we're in now, that one of the sort of narrative lines of this discourse has been a search for how to define the subject, for how to define what matters in this transition. We're obviously in a profound economic and in many ways cultural and civic transition as the old order of licensed spectrum and quasi-monopoly newspapers yields to all of the publishing and broadcasting possibilities of the digital age. And in this period of creative destruction, there's quite a lot of wonderful new experimentation going on, but there's also quite a lot of important independent reporting and journalism that's being destroyed. And I think as the discourse about this change has evolved, I think we're getting closer to the subject. And the subject is, where does the public interest lie in this transition? How is that public interest best defended, given that we live in a society where almost all of the transition is going to be shaped appropriately by private investment, but nonetheless, that transition in private investment is going to be taking place inside a framework of government authority, government regulation, government tax codes, and also it's going to be influenced by the activities of philanthropists and educational institutions, as has been the case throughout the history of post-war journalism. So I think we're slowly moving towards a consensus about how to define the subject and how to define the public interest in it, but part of the purpose this morning is to get closer to that framework. Our first speaker has been himself in the Senate a thought leader in this transition, in my judgment, and I think in the judgment of many of his colleagues. And just to give you a brief outline of what we're going to do today, in just a second I'm going to introduce Senator Ben Cardin, and he's going to stand at the podium and talk for 10 to 15 minutes about the ideas in his recently introduced Newspaper Revitalization Act. When he's finished with his introductory remarks, I'll just coordinate some questions from you for him. When that's completed, we'll turn immediately to the first of two panels to get at this discourse I just outlined a moment ago, and between the two panels, we'll take a short break. Obviously, this is not a system of incarceration. If you need to get up and use the men's room and go out and use your cell phones, please do. But for now, please make sure that your cell phones are off and be courteous to your colleagues when you need to move in and out of the room. As you can tell, we're webcasting today's event live. We also have some broadcasters here with some other cameras. All of what's happening in the room today is on the record. Please bear that in mind when it comes to your turn to ask questions. Please identify yourselves. Please wait for the microphone. And please keep your comments and questions as concise as possible. So welcome again. I think this is going to be an important morning, and I'm very excited to get started. And please let me begin, and please join me in welcoming Senator Ben Cardin to the podium. Senator.
Steve, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here at the New America Foundation. I want to congratulate you on your new facilities. I understand you had some help, stimulus package from the federal government today. It's just part of the new economic program, but let me just congratulate you on your new facilities. It's always a pleasure to accept an invitation to speak at 8:45 in the morning. Since I commute from Baltimore every day, it gives me a chance to check out the road systems and the transit needs in the region. So we thank you. We thank you for that. And I really do thank you for hosting this forum. on basically the future of journalism in America and newspapers. The topic, who pays for the news, you asked the United States Senator to talk about that. Well, I have enough bruises to show that a lot of us pay for the news one way or the other. But your focus is really how do we preserve this great democracy for future generations so that future generations can have a higher standard of living than the current generation. That's our objective. And to me, you need to have a strong democracy in order for that to occur. And to me, the free press, the investigative reporting, the newspapers are all part of that. So this is really an effort to see how we can preserve the type of journalism in America that I think is important for our democracy, important for our way of life. Jay Leno, a few weeks ago, joked that so many newspapers all across the country are going out of business, it's pretty scary. So congratulations to the New York Times, which this week won 5 Pulitzer Prizes. I read it online on Google News. The Detroit Free Press won a Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. It didn't have a print edition the next day to make the announcement. So newspapers across the country are slashing their news bureaus, they're closing their doors, they're going into bankruptcy or they're threatened in bankruptcy. From the Philadelphia Inquirer to the Seattle Post, the Rocky Mountain News, the Philadelphia Daily News, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, and of course, most important to all, the Baltimore Sun papers. David Simon, the former Sun reporter and creator of the HBO series The Wire, recently said, talking about the Baltimore Sun, "I am repulsed at what happened at the Baltimore Sun this week. It's almost unfathomable that the Baltimore newspaper's only plan is slow suicide, with Chicago leeching the last nickels and dimes even to the moment when they shutter the doors. Never has an industry so willingly butchered itself or shown its own products such contempt." And you look at the record of what's happened. By 2008, in that year, we saw the loss of 5,000 newsroom jobs, about 10% of the total newsroom personnel in our country. 59% of the papers had reduced their staff. 61% devoted less space to news. And this is all before the recession really hit. So this was a trend that was occurring before our current economic downturn. Today, less than 1/2 of our newspapers cover what's happening in the Congress of the United States. So the business model just doesn't work for a local newspaper. The business model, which is basically relying on revenues from advertising and subscriptions, is not providing a viable economic opportunities for newspapers. Circulation is down. Since 2001, we've seen the daily circulations reduced by 13.5% for newspapers in America, 17.3% on their Sunday editions. The Afro-American, which is the largest African-American audience paper in the Baltimore, Washington area, for the 6 months ending September the 30th, had a 15% decline in its circulation. And advertising revenues is even worse. Nationwide, advertising revenues in 2008 dropped by 25%, and it's projected to drop another 17% in 2009. So the model is just not providing an economically viable operation for papers to continue to exist under that model. It's important, I believe, that metropolitan newspapers survive for the purposes of journalism. They're the largest news-gathering operation in the local market by far. That's where we rely upon to get our news. They are the source for internet, radio, and TV. The internet is riding on a wave of information produced by newspapers. That's where they get their news. It's from the local journalists. Newspaper reporters forge relationships with people. They build a network which creates the avenues for information. They're critical to independent reporting, both holding accountable public and private institutions. From Watergate to AIDS to the big tobacco problems to Enron to conditions at Walter Reed to the AIG bonuses, the list goes on and on and on. These stories were broke by local journalists doing investigative reporting, which are connected to our newspapers. They provide accountability, a check and balance in our democracy. I always like to quote H.L. Mencken, of course, from the Baltimore Sun. Conscience is the inner voice that looms, which warns us somebody is looking. And that's important for where I work, that we know someone is looking at what we're doing. And journalists provide that check and balance so important to our country. David Simon, testifying before the Senate committee last week, along with Steve, David Simon said, you do not, in my city, run into bloggers or so-called citizen journalists at City Hall or in the courthouse hallways or at the bar at union halls where police officers gather. You don't see them consistently nurturing and then pressing sources. So I think this is essential to a free democracy, to have journalists, to have local papers. And there's been studies that have confirmed that. There was a 2003 survey done by Law, Economics, and Organization that showed that there's a direct relationship between circulation, the amount of circulation of a paper, and corruption. The lower the circulation, the higher the corruption. The Princeton University report on the closure of the Cincinnati Post on December 31st, 2007. Now, the Cincinnati Post was the second newspaper in that market, but it was the largest coverage of local news. About 80% of the local news between the two papers was covered in the Cincinnati Post. And the Princeton study showed that when the Cincinnati Post closed, that local elections became less competitive. And it concluded, if voter turnout and broad choice of candidates and accountability for incumbents are important to democracy, we side with those who lament newspapers' decline. So the expansion of the internet to me is something that's very positive as a purveyor of news. It's extremely important. I believe it's a very positive sign as far as our country is concerned. And once again, quoting from H.L. Mencken, freedom of the press is limited to those who own one. So having the internet allows all of us to be journalists if we want to, because if we have access to the internet, we have a printing press. We can get our message across. That's a very positive sign. But the source of lots of our news, so that we can analyze it and become experts, is the local journalist. So, what can we do about it? It's clear to me that the current model will not work for allowing the continuation of in-depth investigative reporting, and that's why I introduced the Newspaper Revitalization Act. It provides a different economic model for metropolitan papers to be able to continue to exist. It allows them to become a 501c3, a nonprofit, to operate as a nonprofit, similar to how churches operate, or educational institutions operate, or public television and radio operate today. It would allow them another source of revenue so that they can get, in addition to subscription and advertising, they can get contributions, the big advantage of a nonprofit. I believe there are communities where you have foundations, or you have educational institutions, or you have individuals who are willing to help contribute to save their local newspaper because they understand the value of that local newspaper. That would allow another source of revenue so that local papers could continue. It is not the model for all, but may for some. And I think we should look at it. It would preserve the newspaper's ability to be free of government, which I think is important. I think we have to preserve the independence of our press. That's an important point. My record on the First Amendment is pretty clear. I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and I've been a strong proponent of protecting our First Amendment rights. I don't want to see our government interfere with the free press. The nonprofit model is used by religious and educational institutions, and government does not interfere with their way of life. And it's my understanding, Steve, that the New American Foundation is also a nonprofit. And I don't believe government tells you what to do. You're independent. It's a model that I think can work. It would allow for free editorializing on issues that are before the public, as you do today. It would allow for free reporting on all issues. So you would have your options. There are certain restrictions on 501c3s. Those restrictions are basically you can't make specific endorsements. But the last time I checked, it didn't seem to slow down the churches very much, and I doubt if it would have a major impact on the major roles for newspapers in our country. What I also would oppose is a government bailout. I think that would be a huge mistake for the government to come in and try to underwrite the newspaper industry. I think that would compromise the independence of our newspapers, and I would oppose that. This legislation is just the opposite. It has allowed the newspapers to survive without the need for government funds. In fact, I believe the bill will be reported as costing very little. There is some loss of revenue because you're a nonprofit, and because you're a nonprofit, you don't pay taxes. But the newspapers aren't paying taxes today because you have to have a profit to pay taxes, and they're not making money. So this is not a matter of loss of federal funds, and certainly I think protects us from having to have, which I would oppose, direct government support. There is precedent for federal government action. In 1970, the Newspaper Preservation Act was passed, exempting from antitrust laws, where you have two local papers so they can share certain operations as long as they had independent newsrooms. That was passed as an effort to try to help save two local newspapers in a community. Some are seeking further relief from the antitrust laws today. And Attorney General Holder said, and I quote, "I think it's important for this nation to maintain a healthy newspaper industry so that to the extent that we have to look at our enforcement policies and conform them to the realities that the industry faces, that's something that I am going to be willing to do." Well, I'm pleased that the Attorney General wants to look at enforcement. Look, I would love to have two newspapers in my community, but right now I'll settle for one that's truly independent. And that's why I think the legislation that I filed that offers an alternative business model for some local papers to be able to survive is the right way for Congress to go. Thomas Jefferson, a man who was vilified by newspapers daily, once said, "If I had a choice between government without newspapers and newspapers without government, I wouldn't hesitate to choose the latter." Like Jefferson, I believe that a well-informed public is essential to our democratic society. We need to save our community newspapers and investigative journalism that they provide, and I hope that we all can come together to develop a way in which we can accomplish that goal. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator, very, very much. I'm just going to ask one question before I turn to the audience. The bill, I just wanted to ask you to explain what the bill actually does by way of facilitating conversion of newspapers to the nonprofit model. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the tax code that describes 501c3 status permits certain categories of activity that includes education, and the current language might be interpreted reasonably as permitting newspapers to convert, but that your purpose is just to make it clear if I were an investor or a philanthropist who wanted to convert a for-profit into a nonprofit, I might not want to be reviewed later and be told that, oh, well, I didn't qualify. So are you just kind of creating a clear glide path for private decision making?
You're absolutely right. You can operate today a newspaper as a nonprofit. You can do that. And there are new nonprofit newspapers that are associated with educational institutions or faith-based groups, churches, that operate as nonprofits. You can do it today. And therefore, the contributions that you receive from supporters would be tax preferred. You can do it. The difficulty today is, under the current model, is whether you'll be challenged by the IRS if you receive too much of your revenues through advertising or subscriptions, because it appears to be a commercial venture, and it's clearly would be challenged, and it acts as a deterrent for the type of investors necessary to make that type of conversion. So the thought is, particularly with any major metropolitan newspaper, that a conversion to a nonprofit under the current legal structure, it's just not viable, and it's not going to happen unless Congress clarifies the law.
Great, thank you. I'll just recognize people from the audience now. Sir.
My name is Curtis Gans, and I direct something called the Center for the Study of the American Electorate, which deals with voting behavior and encouragement of civic engagement. I'm very grateful for your efforts, but I'd like to throw out another idea. I mean, the real problem about newspapers is readership, and the declining readership, which leads to declining advertising revenue. Let me suggest a sort of five-part idea.
Oh, let's not. 5 parts is too much.
Five parts.
Very
Five parts is 5 sentences. That's all. It includes civic education and current events in the testing for No Child Left Behind. That would force a civics curriculum from the 3rd grade to the 12th. That would allow you to subsidize newspapers without interfering with their freedom of the press for school use, and it would develop a readership habit over 9 years that might pay off on the long run as well as increasing circulation on the short run.
Well done.
Well, I think it's a good proposal. Look, I think that we need to look at our educational institutions, particularly, as you point out, pre-K through 12, and figure out ways that we can have curriculums that are more fitted to the challenges of America, and civic education is clearly one of those areas. I could also talk about environmental education and financial literacy and so many other areas that I hope that we'll have stronger commitments within our school system, which would, I think, provide a stronger desire for what investigative reporting is all about. But quite frankly, I think there is a market for investigative reporting. I think people want the results of investigative reporting. The difficulty today is to get most of that from the internet and radio and TV, even though its origins come from our newspapers or from our periodicals. And I think that what we need to do is just strengthen the model so that we can continue the basic information that's being obtained.
The woman behind you.
Hi. Hello, Senator. My name is Melinda Wittstock, and I'm the founder of Capital News Connection. And we're a nonprofit, 501c3. We cover Congress for about 200 public radio stations around the country where we localize the news. It's interesting to me that our little engine that could is emerging as the only source pretty much now for localized coverage of Congress. One of the things that concerns me, I think the nonprofit model is a good one. It's been good to us. But on the other hand, there are more and more entities scrapping for less and less money from donors, from foundations. And so how do you envision that working? Does there have to be some level of collaboration? How unlimited is the appetite for donors to pay for news?
Yeah. Well, I think your model is a great model, and I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. And I think there will always be a way in which we can find ways of preserving information at a national level. There will always be coverage of Congress, and you're providing a real need for the community by providing that service. The difficulty is you can't focus on what the Maryland congressional delegation is doing, make it even smaller. You can't focus on what the Baltimore metropolitan congressional delegation is doing. Only a metropolitan paper in Baltimore will have that degree of interest in holding us accountable to our local constituents. The problem is, in over half the country today, there is no local paper covering what is happening in Congress. So therefore, the local congressional delegation is basically without inspection, which to me is a dangerous situation. I think there's an appetite for this. I really do. I think the people of Baltimore want to know how I am dealing with the private sector interests that relate to earmarks. I think they're very interested in that. Yes, you can, but you don't know the ins and outs of all the different local institutions in Maryland that have influence, and how their boards operate, and their involvement in the political system in Maryland, and all the things that are involved in how these decisions come about, which I think is important for investigative reporting locally.
Yes.
Art Brodsky from Public Knowledge. Having been a fan of David Simon's, and particularly Season 5 of The Wire, which dealt with the Sun papers, my question is, if newspapers want to keep committing suicide, and if readers want to keep fleeing, what matter will it be if they're a 501c3?
Well, I don't think that newspapers want to go out of existence. I just think the business model doesn't work. I think the local constituency has an appetite for the local news and wants investigative reporting. Investigative reporting, when these articles are written, are very popular. And there's something that is, I think, there's an appetite for it. I think it can commercially work. It just can't commercially work for a for-profit entity that needs to compete today on the delivery of news on medias that are much more likable to particularly younger consumers. So I think it just can't adjust to that. But there is a need. And I think looking at it from the point of view of our country, our democracy is very much impacted by the quality of the news coverage. And I am extremely concerned about looking to the future, the quality of the news coverage from the local communities. And not just government. I'm talking about private sector and government, that we're not going to get that. And I think it's worth an effort. The nonprofit model is exactly that. If there is a community that believes this is important, why shouldn't they have a mechanism that they can rally around to preserve that type of investigative news coverage in their community? I think many local communities are prepared to make the investment to save this. And it's appropriate to give them that opportunity. That's why we have schools and churches, because communities organize for a particular purpose. Why shouldn't they be able to organize for a news purpose?
Yes, that hand up there in the back. Can't see the person associated with the hand.
Mark McCarthy with Georgetown University. Why not hello? In addition to the proposal that you've suggested, which is to allow newspapers to go into the nonprofit mode, look at the system of institutions, nonprofit institutions that already exists in local communities, the local public broadcasting and radio stations that provide a good amount of news and local coverage already and are already recipients of federal money. It's possible to build up the flow of money to those institutions and to allow them to move forward more strongly to cover local news and public affairs without having the compromise of, the government will tell them what to do. They already know how to handle that issue because they're dealing with that kind of firewall protection already.
Well, I find public radio, public TV a very valuable asset in our community. I think what they do is provide an avenue for coverage of certain news that otherwise will not get covered. It doesn't have the commercial interest. What they don't have is the investigative reporting, and they don't have the reporters on the beat. They just don't have that. That's not their purpose. That's not their mission. It is to provide an avenue for shows that otherwise would not have a commercially viable outlet. So I support that, but I just don't think it substitutes for the need for our metropolitan papers.
Well, thank you, Senator, very much. I know you have a busy day to get to, and I very much appreciate, on behalf of New America and the audience, for taking the time to be with us. If I could just ask one last question myself, because you referred to it, and I think a lot of people here who I know would be curious about your answer. Obviously, what you're doing is creating permission for communities, investors, institutions to decide whether to undertake the conversion that you're trying to make easier. Do you have a sense of how concrete the interest in such a transaction might actually be in different communities across the country, or are you just trying to create permission and then letting the sort of civic marketplace, in effect, decide the result?
Steve, that's a great question. And yes, there is interest. I know of foundations, I know of educational institutions who would like to become players in their community and preserving their local newspaper. I think that's the major source of significant resources that are available to help preserve local newspapers. That's their mission in a way, and it's supplemented by having newspapers available to provide the coverage in their community, the investigative reporting, the checks and balances on a democracy. I know of individuals who are interested in doing this and looking for a way to do it. Look, President Obama has instilled a new spirit in America that we all can make a difference, that this country has some fundamental issues that need to be dealt with. We're going to deal with these problems. He's provided a great deal of hope for America's future. And by the way, he's provided hope, I think, internationally for all of us. So I think there's a new spirit of accomplishment in America that we're going to get things done. And one of those things to me is preserving the quality of journalism that America has been famous for. We're going to find a way to do it. We're going to find a way to make sure that we can have the type of journalism that's appropriate for our democracy. I happen to believe that the local newspaper is part of that solution, and communities will come together to save this institution, not just because you'd like to read a newspaper with your morning coffee, but because of the value of our newspaper to our democracy. I think people understand that, and communities will come to the rescue of their paper because of its importance in our society.
Thank you again, Senator. Thank you.